Welcome to episode 12, Tales from a Disappearing City. Back again with Christoph Fringeli. Last time, Christoph, we talked about getting into electronic music, post-punk, the scene in Basel, coming to London to visit gigs and that sort of stuff. What really got you into maybe like the more dance or electronic or techno scene?
On the one hand, it was like kind of a gradual development. I was getting more and more interested in the electronic music in general and into kind of dance music in particular, like bands like Meat Beat Manifesto, for example. Storm the Studio was a really important album for me when it came out. But on the other hand, there was like also kind of a shift in perception, let's say a break, because the independent music scene that like we were talking about in the last episode was that I was also working in as a, employed by a distribution company, was like getting more and more, in my opinion, a bit like a mirror image of the commercial music scene. It was like it had like its own stars, its own like distribution, promotion mechanisms. It's kind of like radio shows that were like kind of fed by certain promoters, and the press was kind of, you would have magazines where there was an interview with the band and then there was a full page ad for the album right next to it or on the back of the issue, and you're like, okay. And when I first heard about white labels like acid house music stuff, I didn't hear much of the music, and a lot of the music that I did hear I wasn't so enthralled with, but the concept of the nameless white label, that was extremely inspiring and triggered a lot of thinking about what should the music be about, how should it be presented, and if it was to be a countercultural kind of movement or event. And there were some of the records that I really liked, the stuff by Future and where there were really the strange noises on the top. But it was more the idea to present things without a star system that was really inspiring and enthralling. And so started to experiment in ways to somehow participate in that thing. We did with Melk's a record that had just beats, so it was meant to be not a product, so to speak, but something that other people would then use.
Yeah, as a tool for DJs.
Exactly, or to even sample from and make your own, breaks from it or whatever. And incorporating more and more elements of that kind of, with those kind of ideas into our music. But I also felt like I needed to make a kind of a break from like the band projects that were the majority of the Vision things, and also because I was moving away from Switzerland to London and kind of tuning in to this completely new, in my experience anyways, new subculture, counterculture of electronic dance music / techno. That, like I said, initially it kind of was not more fascinating as a concept, but then more and more records came out that also were like really weird and noisy and hard, and by 1990 and then especially in 91 it just took off with loads of
I think it was almost like the rise of the DIY culture again. It, like, in one way it did feel a bit like early punk and indie and new wave, as you said, like everyone was suddenly like, well, do you know what did they say, you only need like here's one chord, here's another form of band. It's like, well, you don't need any chords, you can just buy a cheap sampler and off you go.
And there were like endless possibilities. I mean, and people did not stick to conventions initially, and there was also free expression of like, just trying out things with these machines.
Some of the early records I've got, and whether they're early rave records, acid house records, like you said, particularly the UK ones, where it literally was someone with a sampler in their bedroom doing like 3 or 4 tracks. Yes, sometimes they literally are just throwing ideas into the machine, and there almost is like, there's always like one track that's incredibly weird or really out of time or doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but might sound amazing, might sound absolutely terrible. But yeah, as you said, there was no strict genre at the time, or people were just like, trying to create these sort of tracks and throwing stuff in the mix and seeing what comes out.
And for me, that went parallel with, with meeting more people in London, and with my desire to move away from Switzerland and from Basel, and it became increasingly clear that would be London. And
how did it feel when you made that decision? Were you excited just to get to London and get on with like a new sort of adventure, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had put out the word that I was looking for a place to live, so which would have to be a squat, because I had like no capital to move, a lot of my stuff and to rent or let alone buy something. Eventually, through Bourbonese Quark, who I had met a couple of years earlier, we organized a gig for them in Switzerland, in Basel, and in fact some kind of mini tour in Switzerland, and we became friends. And from Quark I heard that there was a space available in South London near the Old Kent Road, and I was like, okay, now let's do it, and packed my things and moved over there in late 91. Set up, I mean, there was quite a lot of squats in that area back in those days. So a whole like communities, sometimes like several buildings in a row, all inhabited by...
Yeah, there used to be like the Southwark Housing Information, I think it was SHIP it was called, so I can't remember what the P stood for, but it's Southwark Housing Information Project, maybe. That was down there, and they used to advise you on how to get housing and obviously squatting issues and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and that was great because you could live with very little overhead and on very little money, and like a lot of freedom. It was also, there was also poverty, and it definitely had like challenging problems as well. But it was definitely a huge opportunity for young people to create cultural, be active in cultural creations, and be able to live with a roof over their head. And that massively changed throughout the 90s, I think, in London. But the first couple of years I managed to live in the same place, in fact, and I was grateful for that. That was pretty amazing. And of course also meeting more people and getting kind of more tuned in what was happening there at the time, and also formulating what I wanted to do with my labels and music from then onwards.
When you first come over, were you going to many clubs or stuff like that, checking out DJs, or checking like the more dance music sort of stuff, or was that going on, or?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I didn't really know that many people who were like initially who were like tuned into this scene, so I had to find out a lot of things by myself. Gradually made connections and acquaintances and so on. So, and I would at first look more. The clubs were a bit more available, let's say, because for the parties you needed to be a bit more tuned into the scene, basically. So there were some, not many, but there were some clubs playing like techno, harder techno stuff, and I would seek those out and gradually meet some of the DJs. And
were you always into the harder techno sort of stuff, or?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, throughout 91, when I was still in Switzerland, I also worked for the same distribution company, and set up a dance department for them, because it became clear that this was going to be like an important part of independent productions and underground music culture. And since I was one of the people who were already really interested in that stuff, they asked me to set that up, and that was also again quite exciting to do, because we'll get like loads of white labels and the latest releases from a lot of German labels at the time, like all this Frankfurt stuff, and also what was super important, the underground resistance stuff. So that was the first wave of Detroit things I kind of heard about and knew a little bit, but it wasn't what I was collecting. That was more like in retrospect later that I got more interested in that as well. But the underground resistance stuff I was interested, like also because of its political kind of,
Well, I was going to say, that all the early UR stuff, the politics was straight on the records, wasn't it? Or like it was there in the imagery and the names and stuff like that. Yeah. Whereas, one of the things was, as we mentioned before, they used to call it faceless techno bollocks. Mm-hmm. But what did they say? Revolution for change. They were talking about riot frequencies and stuff like that. They weren't afraid to, talk about the music, trying to break up control systems, and
exactly, really. So it was like in the air somehow, these kind of ideas, and that like you are and some other people like really confirmed that what we saw as like a radical potential was not some hallucination, but it was actually happening in other places as well around the world. Then there was also Force Inc. and in Frankfurt, for example, who had like some radical political ideas that they brought in from elsewhere. All these things started connecting again and into something that to me was like just as exciting as 10 years earlier when I discovered or a little bit less than 10 years earlier when I started to discover all the, like we talked earlier, the 80s stuff like Cabaret Voltaire and Mark Stewart and so on. So that was great, and so I started DJing as well, slowly, but because I didn't have decks initially. And I decided to basically give up the Vision project and start with a new project which I called Praxis. And the idea was to take all these influences and like create like some kind of own version of what I saw in the radical dance music that was coming out at the time. And it was really like kind of contributing also to like a cultural pool that DJs then would like again remix and change things around and resample and
like you said before, no star system, but actually being involved and communicating and spreading the message.
Yeah, and also the event itself was in a way where people wouldn't like all look to a stage and follow absorb the words of the singer or whatever, but were like,
well, it used to be like that, Christoph, before people were staring at the DJ. Exactly, the DJs used to be in the dark, dingy corner, and no one was looking at them unless they really hated the music and wanted to give them abuse.
Yeah. No, of course, it also changed again, and soon enough, techno and house, etc., became a huge business, obviously. But there was a counter movement to that. There were always this kind of radicalization to like get more experimental and get more weird and combine electronic dance music with other visions of sonic visions. And of course, that's what we also try to push as Praxis throughout its history.
What about radio and all this? Like, were you listening to any like the pirate radio?
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, the pirate radios were really important. Even before I moved to London, when I would visit, I would like record tapes and bring them back. And
so everyone I knew who was not from England who into music, first thing they would do is record pirate radio and take it home, obviously.
Yeah.
you know, I mean, no, well, there was kind of the internet then, but not obviously like nowadays. And those tapes going back would really start a fire somewhere. Yeah, so yeah, you'd record pirate radio. Do you remember some of the stations or what you'd record, or is that in the haze or?
I think one was actually called Rave FM.
Yeah.
But I can't remember.
No, that's fine.
And of course, once I lived in London, would listen to Pirates all the time, over the whole weekend, basically, because I also initially just had like my little kind of stereo cassette radio receiver as the only sound source until I got turntables a little bit later. But that was definitely one of the really important inputs, and then like trying to find some of the tracks that were being played and stuff like that, which was often not so easy.
No, that was the thing, like, because sometimes the DJs would talk. Quite often they wouldn't talk, and you just hear a tune.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I remember for years there were certain tunes I had on tape. I had no idea what they were. Yeah, eventually I found out. But
or you'd get on record shop owners' nerves by coming and playing them.
Some random bleep. Yeah, well, yeah, the classic one trying to hum it, and then I'm like, yeah, no idea, mate.
And then besides the Pirates, there were like the two radio shows, which I think were already mentioned in your podcast, Colin Dale and Colin Favor, which I listened to every single show, at least for some time. Do you remember when they were exactly on the air on Kiss FM?
Do you know what? Was it Wednesday night?
But for how long? For how many years?
Oh, do you know what? I don't actually, but it was probably at least 5 years, 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah, at least initially, those were the shows to listen to, and they would also say what the tracks were, so that was then easier to go and find them, but not always easy, because often they played obscure imports from Germany or America.
Yeah, I mean, Colin Dale had the Outer Limits. He used to call it the Outer Limits, where they play some of the weirder sort of out there sort of stuff.
Yeah, and Colin Favor would play like the harder stuff.
Yeah.
I remember when he played Walk on Bass by Sea-Tank and said like, it can't get any harder and faster than this. And of course there was like 150 BPM and and it got like a lot harder and faster then.
Did you take that as a personal challenge, Christoph?
Probably, I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, I remember there was an old early, I think there was still a good early jungle hardcore, and it was like, there was one, I think there's one tune, it's like 150 BPM, and like people were like, what?
Yeah.
And then there was one that came out 160 BPM, and like, people were like, what?
It's impossible, you can't
get any faster than that.
Move that fast. So that was some kind of ecosystem, you know, with the Pirates and those few radio shows and record shops. And
yeah, I was about to say the record shops. Are there any particular shops you used to go to?
Definitely Jockey's Tunes.
Yes.
He was probably the one, at least for a certain period of time, who had the most of the hardcore imports. Yeah.
Did you have any interesting experiences in Jockey Tunes? Because that could be like quite an interesting place to go into. Like Jockey was quite a character in that shop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nothing specific I would say, but yeah, it was always intense and it was a really cool place. I loved it down when it was at Boyce downstairs near Cambridge Circus.
Is it St. Anne's Court, or was that
was later?
Oh, that was later, was it? Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, have you heard that track he did, like a DJ and his girlfriend? Have you heard that, where he's MCing over the top and he shouts out all the record stores? I think it's 91.
Okay.
I think it's 91, and there's a bit. He's obviously on something quite psychedelic. Cause he starts ranting about all the different, and he just goes, "I feel so positive," and he starts giving all the names of all the people working all the record stores in central London. It's quite an amazing record. But he did that classic tune, Hoovers and Spray Cans.
Yeah.
Which is still kind of a weird record. Like it's the break on it is kind of weird. I don't know. It's kind of slightly got a mad sort of groove to it, but it's a wicked sort of tune. All right, so Chucky's Tunes and any other record
The
stores?
records, the Rough Trade shop, but I knew those from way before.
Yeah.
From the Vision days, they used to sell my records there in the 80s already. Yeah, I used to just walk around in Soho and go from record shop to record shop. There was like Quaff Records, Swell, and Black Market event. I can't remember when they started or when I started going there. A little bit later probably, because when I was getting more interested in drum and bass and so on, that was obviously an important address. Then Sister Ray and the second-hand stores, they were always, you could spend hours going from record shop to record shop. No?
Yeah, I mean, particularly around Berwick Street, wasn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, that kind of has disappeared, and that was there for years. I mean, you've still got record and tape there. Mm-hmm. Or is it Reckless? I always get mixed up. Yeah, I think Reckless is Berwick Street. Yeah.
But there was a record and tape there as well, but I don't know if it's still there.
Yeah, that's gone because they've changed where the market is there.
Of course, Ambient Soho, very important shop, but that was a little bit later.
Yeah. Shouts to Rocket, and also Miss Pink, who used to work in there.
Yeah, I always really massively enjoyed that, and would also, in fact, go around some shops and try to sell them my releases,
Yeah. How did that go?
Mixed bag. Some were not interested in it at all, but Jokey always took them, sold plenty of Praxis records there, and later Ambient Soho was the number one. Yeah, some others were a bit on and off, like Fat Cat took a little bit here and there, but not real. They were getting more into the IDM stuff, and then also like Quaff, I think, used to take some for a while, but then maybe the buyer changed or something like that.
Yeah, it was always interesting going out because I used to do that a little bit. And, some shops would be really nice, and I was a bit like...
And some like really arrogant.
Yeah, exactly.
Ignoring you or something.
Yeah, that was the gatekeeper mentality.
And you stand there with your records.
Yeah.
But no, so I eventually just supplied the ones who were, where there was a relation, and that they also sold the most, of course, then. Not worth getting humiliated just to get rid of 3 copies or something. No,
for sure. I mean, again, that was an era when you could get rid of more copies of records.
Absolutely.
That is the golden era when as someone, if you release vinyl records,
Yeah, I mean, Ambient Soho sold something like 50 copies of Subversion 1, Dark Star. That's pretty unthinkable now that one shop would, sell that kind of number of something like that. But in fact, that happened all over Europe. There were other shops in Vienna, for example. Now Records, they sold stacks. You would bring like a box in, and while you were there, were already the first copies would be leaving the premises again.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so what was on Praxis One then? The first release that you did?
That was some tracks I did. Under the name Scaremonger.
What were you using to make that stuff at the time? Because obviously, you're in the squat in Old Kent Road. You had equipment there, or did you borrow some equipment, or you were using someone else's studio, or?
Actually, you know what? I wrote those tracks still in Switzerland in '91, and then only released them like a bit later. And they were done with an Akai sampler and Atari. Sequencer with Cubase on the Atari. And then soon enough, when I lived in London, I was fortunate enough to use the Bourbonese Quark studio, which was in a squatted house in Malt Street off the Old Kent Road as well, so a few parallel roads away from where I lived, and so really 5 minutes walk to go there. And that was the first Praxis office, the ground floor there, and the studio and rehearsal room was upstairs. And there was some equipment there. I brought my MS-20 over as well.
Do you remember what other bits of equipment there were, like music-wise? Or?
There was a Cheetah sampler.
Yeah, that's a classic cheap sampler from the time.
And an Atari with Cubase, and a Korg Monopoly, and I can't remember what else, a few effects tracks and stuff. It was pretty minimal, but I produced the next records that I released, which was Praxis 4 and 6 and 8 there, using that equipment. You had all the sounds on one floppy disk.
Do you remember how much they could store? It wasn't very much, was
1.4 megabyte, I think.
Yeah, but what was that in length of time? Well, I guess 1.4 megabyte, but yeah, that's like...
Well, the Cheetah had 16-bit sampling, but yeah, so it was like almost nothing, a few seconds. Yeah. You could like you would have to cut your percussion sounds like really tight so they wouldn't use up too much space. And
did you ever have to do that trick where you sped stuff up? Do you know that trick when you're sampling stuff?
Oh, I know what you mean. But
yeah, you record it. You'd speed the record up and record it because then you could slow it down and you could get longer time out your sampler. Yeah.
No, I never did that actually.
Okay. So look, you were putting out. Obviously, yeah, you started putting out vinyl, but you were doing written stuff as well, weren't you? I mean, I might even have some newsletter. I don't know if it talks about Praxis One, or did you have one out for the first Praxis, or was that more like for? I mean, we'll probably get into more detail on Dead by Dawn another time.
Exactly.
But did that start more like Dead by Dawn when the newsletters were coming out?
Yeah. I mean, I had been doing this scene stuff, printed or photocopied more like stuff in Switzerland, and this was also discontinued with the end of Vision, basically, but I always had the plan to do more printed stuff. But I didn't really manage to get that off the ground very quickly. And it was indeed a couple of years into living in London when Dead by Dawn started, that Praxis newsletters, and then Alien Underground and Datacide started. Yeah. But we get to that in a second.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you talked a little bit before about sort of the politics, and like, did you have like some theories that were in your mind that related? Like we kind of talked about it a little bit, but that sort of related to, like you said, this whole scene in London, going there, the independent, the DIY sort of culture, the anonymous sort of artist. Was there sort of ideas that were floating around related to that you can, I don't know, talk about or?
Yeah. I mean, I think it had a lot to do with this like idea of autonomy, of creating like a counterculture versus the perceived mainstream culture, and that would be like kind of started from these occupied cultural centers and the autonomous youth centers and the squats and so on, and then like actually like get bigger, and that's something that was confirmed in a way by the festival scene and so on in the early 90s, when the whole thing like really became a mass phenomenon and so on. So
you talk about legal parties and that sort of stuff, or
illegal parties, like this, or so-called illegal parties.
Yeah.
And so there was a feeling that we're on the right track, that there was like something, because it wasn't about doing something elitist and like just for like some chosen few people, which exists in the underground music scene, but sure. that was definitely not what we had in mind. I always wanted to sell the most number of copies of the most extreme records if possible, It wasn't just to...
How did that strategy work out?
Well, for a while it seemed to go in the right direction. But maybe we'll get to talk a little bit about how that all that changed and how you distribute music, because that's completely different now than it was. If we are talking about record sales, then the strategy was an abysmal failure, because the record sales per se are like obviously down, but it's because the whole way of distributing music has changed. I mean, so it's not, you can't judge it like that.
No, but there was some culture of like loads of, if you like, independent distributors just with vans, wasn't it? Driving around record shops, dropping off records every Friday. Normally on a Friday, piles of white labels, and I mean that was a time when you could like press something up and like shift it out in the vans, and if you're lucky, sell a few thousand copies or something.
Yeah.
And not of something that's literally super commercial. And
I mean, I was lucky enough that I had SRD distribute the early Praxis stuff, and they had like a fairly strong distribution network. They were obviously quite big already from the punk days or post.
Yeah, how long did they go back, SRD? I don't really know. Like, were they?
I think like probably late 70s.
Yeah. Okay.
Something like that. Would have to verify. It could be early 80s, but.
Okay, how did you get in there? Because that is a good.
Because I was the export guy at the rec, and so we were partnering with them.
That is a good connection, yeah.
And they distributed the Vision Records in the UK, and then I went to visit them again, and they took on the first few Praxis Records. Already early on, the kind of, as the records were getting like a bit too hard for the most record shops, then I think after about maybe number 8 or 9, the sales also decreased through those channels, and I eventually went through other channels for certain reasons, but also there was more self-distribution getting more and more important.
Yeah, through parties,
But it was still pretty good to be able to have that kind of distribution at the beginning of, the start of the label. But they were, for example, they weren't doing exports at the time, at least, so I still had to take care of all the outside of UK. But yeah, so the first 2 years of Praxis and of me being in London was doing my own records, working with Bobney's Quark for 2 12 inches and an album that came out on CD. And then we also toured together. We did a US tour, which was quite an adventure. We drove like 12,000 miles and played at extremely obscure venues. And the people were like more expecting the more experimental 80s version of Bobney's Quark, while we were doing more or less full-on techno at that point. So it was sometimes in venues that didn't fit that well, but other times it was in good venues, and we had a lot of fun. It was a good tour. Met our mutual friend Deadly Buddha in Pittsburgh, and which was then another connection in the following years. And returning from that in '93, I think there were met some other people, and the plans were made to make some events. And I can't remember exactly how it came about that we did events at the One-to-One Center in Railton Road in Brixton, which were also mentioned on your podcast a couple of times already.
Yeah, I spoke about that with Howard, obviously, and Neil, Transpontine.
Yeah, the original crew was Jason and Howard. Howard has obviously been on your podcast already. If you haven't watched the episodes, you should. And a DJ called Sparkle. And it was the 4 of us who initially did the first nights. And there were other people involved with the One-to-One Center. There was a night with Bobney's Quark and myself and Sparkle in December '93, which was a pre-Depadon thing, which there's a little bit of that on YouTube as well, of that night filmed by Nomex. And Nomex joined the group organizing the events.
How did you meet Nomex then? Just through him filming stuff?
I think it may even have been at that event, or I think him and Sparkle were friends, or I can't remember exactly. But yeah, somehow it all came together. There were all these connections being made, and then suddenly we were doing these collective things together. And what we wanted to do at the Depadon parties was to combine different aspects of countercultural activities and discourse and music by having a talk event at the beginning of the night, or it was sometimes a presentation of a film or of something. And
do you remember what some of them were, like the discussions, or?
They had quite a range of different topics. We could maybe find some flyers and put them and flash them up, including what sex would be like in an anarchist society, for example, or chaos as a ruling class conspiracy, and things like that. Yeah, I would have to look at the flyer collection. I mean, do I have them here? Also, I mean, because on the flyers, the information about the talks was super minimal. It was just like one line, you know, we had Sadie Plant talk, for example. But that was then, that kind of content was then added by the Praxis newsletters, which the first one, they were basically launched along with the parties and were like a kind of additional information outlet to have often contributions by people who did presentations or at least something about them, and other news around the scene that were happening. I had like a top 10 in there of new tracks, new music, and some kind of mixture of poetry and theory and rants and polemics sometimes that we printed ourselves at the 121 Center. It was one of these.
Yeah, hand where you roll it, and the bit. Yeah, I mean that's proper old-fashioned, radical production of literature. Yeah.
So yeah, there was this printed aspect. There were the talks. Then we had the party in the basement from the third event onwards. It's actually the first two were actually on the ground floor, which I had forgotten about, but I was reading the newsletters recently, and like finally we were allowed or managed to open the basement for this. And then we had a shrill out lounge, as we called it, upstairs, the electronic disturbance zone, with more noise and experimental music most of the time, and the bar. And yeah, so it was actually a very small venue, right? But there were like all these. It
wasn't very big at all.
And there were all these things happening simultaneously. Well, of course, the talks were happening at the beginning, and then the music started. But there were quite a few aspects that happened simultaneously as well. It was a really great experience, and there was also the desire to expand the publishing side, and a scene called Alien Underground came out in 2 issues at the beginning, in 94, the first issue, in 95, the second one. And that was parallel to the Praxis newsletters and Depadon events.
Yeah, I mean, this is something you've continued on, isn't it, throughout
your
life? You've had publications and linked to the music.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, that eventually we decided to finish the Depadon events. We had like this idea of doing another 7 events or something it was, and then after 23 parties we finished it. We put a compilation record out with many of the artists, including yourself, and many of the artists who played down there, including Controlled Weirdness and Tora and Somatic Responses and Brandon Spivey and Richie Anderson and so on. And they had an insert by TechNet, which was a project by Jason and Howard, which went on also parallel to all these activities. Was Howard called it a glorified flyer. It was a very inspiring body of texts that was trying to come to terms in a radical way with what did it mean, this like faceless and lyricless music, and how was it a part of a radical kind of countercultural movement. They are actually all available on the Datacide website, I should say, because the original flyers are probably pretty much impossible to find again, but we did reprint them many years later in Datacide number 12, and they're downloadable as a little kind of booklet thing on the website.
Howard talks a lot about the TechNet stuff and some of the theory from that, so it's worth checking out what he just, he talks in depth about what they wanted to accomplish, and the insert that they did for the Dead by Dawn LP almost being as in the shape of a vinyl record as well.
Yeah, and all that. Then we finished this. The last talk at Dead by Dawn was about who's going to carry on, because we thought we would just pass on the torch, but that happened not exactly in that way that we thought, but I think other people carried on with, the harder experimental kind of dance music that we tried.
Why did you think you had to stop, Christoph? I
think it was just a good idea to not make it like something that was taken for granted, and that would just like go on until it was like everyone was bored, and it had like a great momentum, and I think it came relatively spontaneously. It's not that we were sick of it or something, and wanted to finish it. Quite on the contrary, I think it was an idea that just occurred to make it, to kind of intensify the whole thing. And it was actually the last parties were like getting more and more crazy, I think.
Yeah,
more
exactly.
and more busy,
it was.
I
I do remember going to all the well, I went to most of the. I didn't go to the very first Dead by Dawns, but then I went to virtually all of them for definitely the second half of the run of Dead by Dawn. And like you said, as it was like, there's only 4 to go, there's only 3 to go. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's actually that bit on the album, isn't there? Where's me on the pirate radio with Nomex recorded actually. Yeah. And it's me saying, get down there or something. There's only 2 or 3 to go or something like that. And well, it's classic, really. Yeah, like you said, they were intensifying and probably getting more busy, and then you stop them. So that's don't know if that's a good marketing strategy or not. But yeah, you went out on a high for sure. And I remember, I do remember the last party.
Yeah. That was. It was great. It was definitely unique as well. But yeah, then things again, like, mutated. It wasn't that we were stopping doing things. Howard went on to do the break flow scene. Then Datacide was conceived and started in '97, still going on in various shapes and forms. That kind of idea to, combine these strains of radical politics and experimental electronic music. And I should also say it was really not just what we did or something. There was a wider movement. There were different scenes. I think it's mentioned in one of the podcasts as well. The autotoxicity and breakflow I already mentioned, and some more like music-oriented scenes like Shemo, for example. And there was a whole pre-internet kind of media subculture going on, Yeah, I mean, we actually had, someone brought like a machine, and we had like some internet connection thing going at one of the Dead by Dawn events. I can't remember how well it worked though, and I have to say that, getting on the internet was definitely exciting, but the connections were like so slow and so sluggish back then that I have to say there was a bit of a delay. I feel sometimes should have gotten into it nevertheless more than we did. There was the C8 side, which was obviously a really important thing and grew into something much bigger, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then I feel since we were involved in all like the physical releases, entering the internet was a little bit slow, even though we were aware, and there was a website like really quite early on, but we didn't really update it so much, and it was a little bit a slow beginning until the connections got better and so on. A certain role in that played a place called Backspace near London Bridge, because they had like a fast internet connection there, and you could somehow become a member or something and go there and use the machines.
Yeah, I'd love to remember what the fast internet connection was back then, but that was probably very slow. But it was fast for the time, for sure.
Yeah. And then it became more realistic to do stuff. We did, in fact, a internet radio from Backspace in the 90s that I would have to look up exactly when that was. Datacide radio from Backspace.
Well, do you know what? I remember doing one. I think it might have been with you and Nomex. And I've got a feeling we did something like some 3-hour show on there, 3-4 hours, something like that. And it was on Real Media. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is like most people don't even know what that is. But it was just like really basic sort of audio player that you could stream over the internet. And I don't know, I remember like even about 10 or 15 years, they were still up there for a while. they're obviously not up there anymore.
I think the page is still up there, but I think the content isn't anymore. I think they archived the pages.
Okay.
I haven't looked in the last couple of years, but it was relatively recently. It was still, but you couldn't actually.
Yeah.
For quite a long time, there was still some content. Some links worked, some didn't.
Yeah.
But all that stuff is also, disappearing from.
Well, yeah, that feels like ancient history. I did bump, shouts to James from Backspace. I did bump into him recently at a gig, and I hadn't seen him for years. But that was, definitely ahead of its time of.
Yeah, and it was great, and they definitely tried out things that are totally normal now. But then it was ahead of its time, like the streaming things, or also. When there was the Reclaim the Streets in 1999, they would literally do a film video out on the street, and then people would bring it to Backspace, and it was like transmitted. Yeah. That was like really.
No, I remember that. I do remember them doing that, and that was really like, oh my god, this is amazing.
Yeah, so all this came in the second half of the 90s. Should actually also mention Reclaim the Streets, because that was a kind of another important kind of political development in London at the time, insofar that it combined the using sound systems in protests, and that was quite important. I think it was often street occupations, and then it kind of culminated in the Carnival Against Capitalism in '99, where the city of London was kind of flooded with various activities and protests. Parallel to Praxis, and there were of course like more and more other labels as well, because it was also very much encouraged to press up your own music. I often was approached by people who wanted to have their music pressed, and I was like, do it yourself, and then we can help each other distribute the stuff. And that created new networks. And I'm not saying I created them, but it was a part of they created themselves. There were other people who thought along the same lines. It was obviously, again, something that was in the air. There was Spiral Tribe with Network 23, where they pressed up their own releases and distributed them like completely themselves. I usually had like more like a multi-pronged approach of still using, record shops and distributors, and then our own networks, and then some of the harder labels kind of formed this subnet network that also included like Stormcore as a kind of breakaway from the Network 23 thing, and Audio Illusion recordings and Ambush, and like some of the most amazing records at the time. There was obviously things like also like more electro things. Like I think Battle Tracks was also going a little bit through that, and your own label obviously.
Yeah, I was on the subnet. We talked about this with Ben on a recent episode about the creation of the subnet, and Mark Spiral visiting Ben and taking all these records off him to distribute. And after he left, Lucy, his girlfriend, said to him, "Oh, did he pay you for these records?" And Ben's like, "No, he just said he'd be back in a few months." And and Mark did come back and give Ben the money. Spoiler alert, yeah. So, but yeah, it was a new way, wasn't it? Of
definitely, and that really extended all over like France, and especially France was like a fertile ground, but also Italy and Germany, and so there were new networks developing. A lot of swapping. That was also a little bit pre-internet. Okay, the internet already existed, but it was not.
No.
It wasn't like everybody's got a online shop yet. So swapping and selling stuff locally was something that was to everybody's advantage. It worked really well for a while.
And these parties in the middle of like random places, them records were getting to people who wouldn't normally have had access, like you said, in some obscure, you know, Quarry in France or
Yeah.
wherever, like they're getting all these random weird electronic techno records that definitely had a knock-on effect, and that was outside the mainstream.
Created a dynamic kind of scene and discourses, and that went well beyond the UK. Obviously, it was especially in France. There was like a strong scene developing. There was networks developing that reached to Berlin, to Rome, to all over the place. Really, to the US as well.
Yeah.
But you know, often these like very powerful movements only have a certain amount of time where they are like kind of unified, like one big wave kind of thing. But then they develop in all kinds of different directions again, and people do different things. And
they splinter off, or they become a cliche themselves. Because just in that way, that there was all that sort of, if you like, these records, these free party techno records. Then obviously after a while, they become a little bit all sounded similar, and
exactly.
I mean, some of the Network 23 records, they had people like Somatic Responses, amazing, Caustic Visions, incredible, Unit Mobius, and they had this diverse, and then after a while, some of them sort of technical records all became the same sort of fast sort of techno, which is fine for the rave, but again, they became a bit more one-dimensional, shall we say?
Yeah.
But that's just how music and art and culture works, I guess. The waves go out, and then we're waiting for the next little tsunami.